Hey everyone, ready to dive deep? Today, we're going to be exploring a protein called MLKL. It's way more interesting than it sounds, trust me. We're going to be using a 2021 review article from the journal Cell Death and Differentiation. It goes into all of MLKL's different roles, especially when it comes to cancer.
You know what's really cool about MLKL? It was first discovered as this key player in necroptosis, which is a type of programmed cell death. But now we're finding out it's involved in a whole bunch of other things too.
Okay, you've definitely got my attention. But before we get into all that, let's start with the basics. I think most people have heard of apoptosis, which is like the classic way cells self-destruct. So how's necroptosis different from that?
Yeah, you're right. Apoptosis is kind of like that quiet, controlled cell death. Necroptosis, though, it's more like the cell just explodes.
Whoa, that's intense. Why would a cell choose to go out with a bang like that?
Sometimes it's the only option. Like if the normal apoptosis pathway is blocked, which can happen in certain diseases, or, necroptosis can be triggered by things like infections or injuries.
Ah, so it's like a backup plan when the cell's really stressed out, and that's where MLKL comes in.
Exactly. MLKL is what actually triggers this whole dramatic cell death thing. You could even call it the executioner of the necroptosis. Basically gets activated by this other protein called RIPK3, and that kicks off this whole chain reaction, and boom, the cell membrane breaks down.
Wow, so it's MLKL that flips the switch from like normal cell to total explosion? That's a lot of power for one protein.
It really is. And to really understand how it works, we need to look at its structure. MLKL has two main parts. The 4-HB domain, which is the part that actually causes the cell to burst. And then there's the PSKD domain. That's the part that interacts with RIPK3.
So RPK3 and MLKL work together, kind of like a lock and key.
That's a great way to think about it. RIPK3 activates MLKL through phosphorylation, which is where it attaches a phosphate group to a specific spot on MLKL. That's like turning the key to unlock MLKL's ability to, cause cell death.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's where things get really interesting. The research is showing that MLKL isn't just waiting around to blow up cells. It seems to have other, I guess you could say, side hustles going on too.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of those functions have nothing to do with necroptosis. MLKL can be busy at work, even when the cell's totally healthy.
So we're talking about a protein that can cause these crazy explosions, but it's also got a day job.
Pretty much. And that's what makes it so cool to study. One of these side jobs is something called endosomal trafficking.
Endosomal trafficking, that sounds pretty intense. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So think of it this way. Every cell's got its own waste management system, right? Like a tiny little garbage disposal. It needs to get rid of old or damaged molecules to keep things running smoothly. MLKL helps with that, especially with sorting and breaking down certain molecules like TNF-TNFR1 and EGF-EGFR.
So MLKL is basically a cleanup crew, making sure the cell stays organized. Why is that important when we're talking about cancer?
Well, if that whole waste management system gets messed up, things can start to build up. And that can actually contribute to cancer developing.
Ah, so too much clutter is a bad thing, even on a cellular level. But it sounds like MLKL's cleanup duties don't stop there. The article also mentioned something about membrane repair.
Right. Isn't it crazy? MLKL can cause the cell membrane to burst during necroptosis, but it also helps repair the membrane during that process, working with something called ESCRT3. It's like it breaks things down, but then helps to fix them too.
So it's like a demolition crew and a construction crew all in one.
You got it. And that repair process buys the cell some time before it finally dies, allowing it to send out these inflammatory signals that can affect how the immune system responds to the cancer.
So even when it's playing the executioner, MLKL is still influencing things on a larger scale. This is definitely getting more complex.
Oh, yeah. And there's another layer to think about. How MLKL interacts with the cell's recycling system, which is called autophagy.
Right, autophagy. That's where the cell breaks down its old parts and reuses the pieces, like a recycling center.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that during necroptosis, MLKL actually blocks autophagy from happening.
Wait, hold on. So it's pro-recycling in some cases and anti-recycling in others. This is definitely not a simple on-off switch.
You're telling me researchers are still trying to figure out this whole relationship between MLKL, autophagy, and necroptosis, but it could have major implications for cancer research because, as you know, cancer cells often use autophagy to help themselves survive. And there's more. It turns out MLKL isn't always about, destroying things. It can actually help with regeneration, too.
Wait a minute. The executioner protein helps things grow back. That's pretty wild.
It is. When a nerve gets injured, for example, MLKL helps to break down the myelin sheath, that protective coating around nerves, so the damaged axons can regrow.
So it's kind of like MLKL is a demolition crew, but then it also lays the groundwork for new construction.
That's a great way to put it. And get this, MLKL is also involved in muscle stem cell regeneration, which could be relevant for muscle wasting that happens with some cancers.
So we've got MLKL involved in waste management, repair, blocking recycling, and regeneration. Is there anything this protein doesn't do? Maybe it's also doing our taxes somewhere in the cell.
Uh-huh. Well, who knows? It also seems to have some functions inside the nucleus, the control center of the cell.
Hold on, I thought MLKL was all about the cell membrane. What's it doing in the nucleus?
That's what's so interesting. It seems like some MLKL actually goes into the nucleus and forms a complex with RIPK1 and RIPK3, but this seems to be totally separate from cell death.
So even more multitasking. What's this nuclear MLKL actually doing in there?
Well, one of its roles seems to be regulating the expression of adhesion molecules on endothelial cells, the cells that line blood vessels.
Okay, so why are these adhesion molecules on blood vessels so important?
Think of it this way. These molecules affect how immune cells interact with the endothelium, and that's super important for both inflammation and metastasis, which is how cancer spreads.
Ah, so even though MLKL isn't directly killing cells in this case, it's still affecting how cancer behaves. It's almost like it's pulling strings behind the scenes.
Exactly. And there's one more piece of the puzzle. MLKL also has specific functions in immune cells.
Okay, let's talk immunity. So does this mean that MLKL helps our bodies fight off infections?
It's a little more complicated than that. For instance, it contributes to something called NLRP3 inflammasome activation, which is a key part of the innate immune response. Our body's first line of defense against pathogens.
So in some cases, it's like MLKL's on our side helping us fight off those invaders.
Unfortunately, it's not always that simple. MLKL also helps neutrophils, a type of white blood cell, form nets. Those are neutrophil extracellular traps. They can trap and destroy pathogens, which is good.
But I'm guessing there's a but here.
You got it. The problem is that these nets can also protect tumor cells from immune attack, making them harder to get rid of.
So it's like MLKL's playing both sides. Sometimes it helps the immune system, and sometimes it actually makes things worse.
That's right. And that brings us to the big question. What is MLKL's role in cancer? Is it friend or foe?
Honestly, after hearing about all these different functions, I'm even more confused. It's like MLKL is a double agent. We don't know whose side it's really on.
I know, right? The research shows there's no easy answer. It seems like MLKL's role in cancer depends on a lot of things. The type of cancer, the stage of the disease, even the specific environment within the tumor.
So context is key.
Absolutely. Let's start by looking at the evidence that MLKL can actually be an anti-cancer factor.
Okay, give me some good news here.
Well, studies have found that low MLKL expression is linked to worse survival rates in a lot of cancers, like pancreatic, colon, gastric, cervical, and ovarian cancers.
So if low MLKL is bad news, does that mean having more MLKL is always better? Is it that simple?
Biology is rarely that simple. But the data does seem to suggest that in these cancers, having more MLKL is associated with better outcomes.
Yeah.
We also see MLKL downregulation in AML and breast cancer. So it's possible that MLKL's presence might actually help keep these cancers under control.
Okay, so in some cases, more MLKL seems to be a good thing, and this probably has to do with its ability to trigger necroptosis, right?
Right on. Cancer cells are really good at avoiding death, especially apoptosis. But if we can trigger necroptosis, it's like we've got this secret weapon. We can destroy those cancer cells, even if they've figured out how to avoid apoptosis.
So we're basically using MLKL to force those cancer cells to self-destruct, even if they've become resistant to other methods.
Exactly. And it gets even better. Introducing MLKL into tumor cells can actually trigger an anti-tumor immune response. It's like we're training the immune system to recognize and attack the cancer.
That's incredible. So maybe MLKL is a double agent, but working for the good guys, fighting cancer on multiple fronts.
There's definitely potential there. However, we can't forget about the other side of the coin. There's also evidence that MLKL can actually help cancer in some situations.
Oh no, not the double agent again. How could MLKL help cancer?
Remember how necroptosis causes that cell explosion? Well, that releases a bunch of inflammatory molecules. And while inflammation's a natural part of healing, if it's chronic, it can create an environment where tumors can actually thrive.
So in this case, it's like MLKL is helping to create a comfy little home for cancer cells.
Kinda, yeah. And remember those side hustles we talked about? The roles MLKL plays in receptor turnover and membrane repair? Well, those functions might actually help cancer cells survive and become resistant to treatment.
Ugh, I knew it was too good to be true. Are there any specific examples of MLKL actually helping cancer?
Unfortunately, yes. For instance, in pancreatic cancer, MLKL seems to actually promote tumor growth. It does this by recruiting immune cells that suppress the anti-tumor response. It's like calling in backup for the enemy.
That's just wrong. Are there any other examples of MLKL's dark side?
Yeah, there's this interesting case of constitutively active MLKL in some AML cells. This suggests that in those specific cells, MLKL might actually be helping them survive and grow.
This is getting incredibly complicated. So how can we sum up MLKL's role in cancer? Is it ultimately good or bad?
Honestly, it's both. And to make things even more confusing, there are these conflicting findings about MLKL's role in metastasis, the process of cancer spreading to other parts of the body.
Okay, let's try to unravel this metastasis mystery.
Okay.
How could MLKL be involved in cancer spreading?
Well, some research suggests that MLKL might help cancer spread by promoting necroptosis of endothelial cells. Those are the cells that line blood vessels. That can make it easier for tumor cells to escape from the bloodstream and travel to other places.
So MLKL is creating an escape route for the cancer cells? Seriously?
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
It might also create this inflammatory environment in the original tumor that makes metastasis more likely. And some studies even suggest that MLKL can directly make cancer cells more aggressive and better at migrating and invading other tissues.
Yikes. That's scary. So if we could just block MLKL activity, would that stop metastasis?
I wish it were that easy, but it's not that simple. There are also studies that say the opposite, that MLKL might actually stop metastasis in some cases.
Ugh, more contradictions. So what's the bottom line here?
The bottom line is that we need more research to understand MLKL's role in metastasis. It's a really complex process with a lot of factors involved, and it seems like MLKL's influence depends on the type of cancer and other things.
Okay, so MLKL's role in cancer is super complicated. It can be helpful or harmful depending on the situation. What other important insights did the research point out?
One key thing is that MLKL expression itself, how much of the protein is in a cell, is really dynamic and depends on the context. It's not just a set amount. It's constantly being regulated and fine-tuned.
Interesting. So how is MLKL's expression controlled? What affects how much of it is in a cell?
Well, here's an interesting comparison. Think about RIPK3, that other protein involved in necroptosis. Its expression is often silenced in cancer cells through something called promoter methylation, which is a pretty permanent change.
Yeah.
But MLKL expression is much more variable. It responds to different things.
So MLKL is more adaptable than RIPK3.
Exactly. And one of the major things that regulates MLKL expression is interferon signaling. Both type I and type 2 interferons can actually increase MLKL levels, which links it to the immune response.
Interferons, those are like the body's alarm system for viruses, right? They tell the immune system to kick into gear.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And this connection to interferons could be really important for cancer therapies that are trying to boost the immune system's attack on cancer cells.
So if we can figure out how to control MLKL levels, we might be able to make those treatments even better. Is that something researchers are looking into?
Definitely. And it's not just interferons that can affect MLKL expression. There are certain chemicals and transcription factors that can play a role too.
So it's this whole complex web of regulation, just like everything else with this protein. Did the research talk about any mutations in the MLKL gene itself?
Yes, it did. The article mentioned mutations in the MLKL gene and how they might affect how it works, especially in cancer.
So changes in the MLKL gene itself could affect how it behaves. What kinds of mutations are we talking about?
Well, some mutations, like the F385I mutation, might not completely stop necroptosis, but they could change other functions of MLKL. Others, like the L291P mutation, seem to be what we call loss-of-function mutations. They actually prevent MLKL from inducing necroptosis altogether.
So depending on the specific mutation, MLKL could be working differently or not working at all.
Yep. And there's another mutation, E351K, that's been found in lung carcinoma. This one might affect how MLKL binds to ATP, which is the molecule that provides energy for lots of cellular processes.
So this mutation could be messing with MLKL's energy supply, which could change how it functions.
That's one possibility. But we need more research to really understand what these mutations and others mean for MLKL's function. It's a whole new area for cancer researchers to explore.
Wow, that was a lot to take in. We started talking about MLKL as this simple protein that triggers necroptosis, but now we've seen it's so much more than that. Waste management, repair, regeneration, the immune system, even stuff in the nucleus. It really is like a Swiss Army knife of cellular functions. And when it comes to cancer, well, it seems like it can be both good and bad.
It really depends on the context. Understanding how complex this protein is super important if we're going to develop new cancer therapies.
So where do we go from here? What are the big takeaways? And what does this research mean for cancer treatment in the future?
I think the main takeaway is that we found a really powerful tool in MLKL. We're just starting to figure out how it works and all the things it can do.
It's like we've discovered a new gadget, but we're still reading the instruction manual.
Exactly. The fact that MLKL can trigger necroptosis in cancer cells, even those that don't respond to apoptosis, is a big deal. And we might be able to use its ability to boost the immune response, too.
But we have to remember that MLKL can also have negative effects, like making inflammation worse and even helping cancer cells survive.
Right. There are definitely risks to consider. We need to understand how MLKL acts in different cancers and at different stages so we can maximize the benefits and minimize the risks.
It's all about figuring out when and where targeting MLKL would be the most effective and safest approach.
Absolutely. And it's a great example of why personalized medicine is so important. MLKL's expression levels, the presence of certain mutations, and the specific environment of the tumor all matter. Those are all things that could affect how someone responds to treatments targeting MLKL.
You know, it's amazing to think that we're talking about a single protein, but it has such huge implications for how we treat cancer.
That's what makes this kind of research so exciting. The more we learn about the complexities of cancer, the closer we get to developing new and better therapies.
So before we wrap up, is there anything you want our listeners to think about?
Well, we know that MLKL does a lot of different things and that its expression can change a lot. So could that explain why some people respond better to certain treatments than others? Could MLKL hold the key to personalized cancer care?
That's a really great question, and it really shows why we need to keep doing research in this area.
I agree. Even though MLKL is complex and there are challenges, this research gives us hope for new and innovative ways to fight cancer.
It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you and our listeners. We've learned so much about this fascinating protein. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.